Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
It happened on the night of my mother's 65th birthday, a night she had carefully orchestrated like some twisted stage performance, where every guest, every laugh, and every sip of champagne felt rehearsed, as if the entire family had been summoned to witness not only her celebration, but also my humiliation. The house was glowing with rented lights, the tables crowded with expensive catering she insisted on paying for even though she always complained about how everyone else wasted money, and the air was thick with the mix of perfume, arrogance, and the faint sound of glasses clinking in forced cheer. I stood near the edge of the dining room, swirling a glass of wine I didn't even want, when she tapped her glass with the silver fork and called for attention with that sharp, self-satisfied smile that made everyone instinctively fall silent. She looked straight at me while pretending to address the entire room, announcing in her perfectly polished voice that after long and careful thought, she had decided to update her will, and as of that very moment, I was no longer part of it. The words slid out as smoothly as if she had practiced them in front of a mirror, and the pause that followed was filled with gasps, a few nervous laughs, and the unmistakable silence of people who enjoy watching a train wreck but don't want to admit it. My brother Daniel, who has never worked an honest day in his life but still manages to lecture others about success, smirked into his scotch glass, while my sister Michelle, who thrives on pity and attention, widened her eyes as if she were shocked, though I could see the smug satisfaction hiding behind the act. For a moment, I felt the familiar sting, that old ache of being singled out and dismissed, the same feeling I had carried since childhood, standing in the shadows while she praised them and criticized me. But then, instead of breaking down or storming out like she expected, I let a smile spread across my face, one that didn't shake or falter. I raised my glass high enough that every guest could see it shimmer in the light, and with a calmness that almost surprised me, I said, "That's fine. It doesn't matter. I've already secured everything you can't touch." My voice cut through the tension like a blade, and for a second, the room didn't know how to react. My mother's smile faltered, just a flicker, but it was enough to tell me that she hadn't anticipated this response. She was expecting tears, outrage, maybe even begging, all the ammunition she had relied on my entire life. Instead, she got defiance wrapped in composure, and worse, she got a riddle. Relatives exchanged confused glances, whispers spread across the room, and I watched Daniel's smirk falter into suspicion, while Michelle's faux concern started to waver. They wanted to know what I meant, but I wasn't going to hand them the satisfaction of clarity. I took a slow sip of wine, savoring the taste not because I liked it, but because I liked the silence that followed, the kind of silence where people are forced to replay words in their heads and wonder what they missed. My mother, never one to let control slip, tried to laugh it off, saying something about how I always had a flair for drama, but her eyes betrayed her unease. She was calculating, trying to read me, trying to determine if I was bluffing or if I had, in fact, done something she couldn't undo. The rest of the night unfolded with a strange heaviness. The music resumed, the waiters continued serving, and the guests pretended to relax, but the air carried a sharp edge of curiosity and unease. Every conversation seemed to circle back to me, though nobody dared to ask directly. Daniel cornered me near the bar later, throwing out half-joking comments about how I must have found some sugar daddy or hit the lottery, but behind the joke was genuine fear that maybe I had something he didn't. Michelle tried her softer approach, asking in a syrupy tone if I was okay, as if she hadn't been waiting for this moment all her life. I gave them both the same answer, a polite smile, a shrug, and silence. What they didn't understand, what my mother didn't understand, was that I had stopped playing their game years ago. While they scrambled for her approval, while they relied on her promises and the scraps she dangled in front of them, I had been busy building something of my own. I had been learning, planning, and securing quietly and without applause. And now, on the night when she thought she could strip me bare in front of everyone, I was the only one in the room who wasn't actually vulnerable. The irony wasn't lost on me that her big announcement was supposed to crown her control, but instead, it planted seeds of doubt in the very children she favored. They would go home that night wondering if she had truly done right by them, or if somehow I had already won without their knowledge. I watched their faces shift from amusement to confusion, from confidence to unease, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: power. When I finally left the party, walking out into the cool night air, I didn't feel humiliated or angry. I felt steady. My mother could keep her will, her grand declarations, and her shallow loyalty tests. Because while she was busy trying to cut me out, I had already carved myself a place she couldn't erase. And the beauty of it was that they would spend days, weeks, maybe even years trying to guess what that place was, and by the time they figured it out, if they ever did, it would already be too late. That night was the moment everything shifted, not just for me but for all of them. They just didn't realize it yet. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of how quickly their laughter would turn to desperation once they learned the truth I had been holding in silence all along. The morning after the party, I woke up with the kind of headache that doesn't come from wine or music, but from being forced to breathe the stale air of other people's expectations for too many hours. And as the sun cut across my blinds like a reprimand, I lay there and replayed the room, the fork against the glass, the practiced smile, Daniel's little swaggering smirk that belongs on a billboard for a car he did not pay for, Michelle's wide-eyed pity act that she wears like a silk blouse she never bothers to wash, and the chorus of cousins pretending not to enjoy the spectacle the way people at a minor league game pretend they came for wholesome entertainment and not to see a pitcher lose his nerve. I thought about how long this had been rehearsed, not the announcement itself, but the machine around it, the decades of soft dismissals and sharpened compliments, the way my mother learned to make favoritism look like good parenting and control look like love. And I laughed into the pillow. Because it struck me that for someone who worried constantly about legacy, she never noticed that I had stopped auditioning to be part of hers a long time ago. I can mark the moment the wheel started to turn, not some grand declaration, but a Tuesday in late spring when I stood in a grocery aisle comparing store brands, because I was paying off my student loans while working 2 jobs. And I felt a kind of bone-deep clarity that if I kept trying to buy a seat in a family economy where the currency was approval, I would go broke and bitter, so I decided to invest in assets that did not ask for permission. Starting small with a brokerage account I opened. With the same concentration most people reserve for wedding vows, adding 20 here and 40 there, cutting through prospectuses on my lunch breaks, learning what compound interest actually feels like when it is yours rather than some motivational poster in a break room. Meanwhile, the golden boy posted motivational quotes about hustle over photos of borrowed boats, and the princess collected sympathies the way some people collect limited edition tumblers, and our mother floated through church potlucks and neighborhood committees like a chairwoman of a foundation that didn't exist, dispensing pronouncements about responsibility while quietly letting me take the messy tasks no one thanks you for, like driving her to the county clerk to help with paperwork and then being told afterward that my signature on a form had been just a witness thing, sweetheart, except I learned to read entire paragraphs before I put ink to anything and started bringing my own pen that refused to move. Until I understood every single line. People imagine revenge arrives like a thunderclap, but most of the time it is a series of quiet recalibrations, a shift in posture, a steady accumulation of receipts, literal and figurative, that you file in a mental cabinet until the day someone taps a fork to a glass and tries to set your worth in public, and that is when you realize you already priced yourself out of their market, so the auctioneer's voice becomes background music. I kept teaching myself the boring things that make power sticky, how beneficiary designations outrun wills, how title and possession are less romantic but more decisive than sentiment, how a notarized page with the right writer can close doors without slamming them, how a storage lease in your name is not an errand, it is a vault, and how people who live for applause rarely look inside the boxes labeled old paperwork because there is no audience for that. When I was a teenager, after my grandmother died, I was the only one who helped clean out her duplex because Daniel had a big game and Michelle had a bigger breakdown, and my mother delegated sorting to me with the kind of tone that tells you your labor is expected and will be forgotten. So I stacked quilts and photo albums and the fireproof box that nobody could find the key for, and I did the thing I always did, which was take responsibility for gravity so everyone else could feel light. And years later, when the family decided that the storage unit holding those boxes was Mom's, no one bothered to remember that the lease had been opened using my ID because I happened to be the one at the counter that day. Which is how I learned that invisibility can be a deed if you choose to notarize it with patience. I never flaunted it, I never dangled it like a threat. I just paid the bill every month like a boring person who loves automatic withdrawals, and if my mother bragged at church about preserving our heritage, I nodded and passed the casserole, because I understood that a thing is not yours because you speak about it prettily, it is yours because you kept the key while everyone else practiced speeches. After the party, I drove to the storage facility with a cup of gas station coffee that tasted like burnt decisions, and I walked past the rows of doors that looked like a neighborhood made for secrets, and I opened ours with the same measured calm I used at the party. Then I took my time, not to loot but to cure it, because this was not about petty theft, it was about removing the leverage that people think they have when they point to objects and call them history. So I lifted the quilts that still smelled faintly of cedar. I slid the photo albums into a rolling crate, and I pulled the fireproof box out from under the stack where I left it on purpose years ago so that it would look inconsequential and heavy, and therefore safe from the grabby and the theatrical. On the metal lip inside the box was the spare key I had made when I was 20 and tired of being locked out of rooms where other people told stories about my life, and under the first layer of letters was an envelope with my grandmother's tidy handwriting, the one I had read 20 times and then folded back so the fold lines wouldn't give away how important it was, and next to it were the copies I had made for my own files, because I do not believe in solitary points of failure. Before noon, I had moved what mattered into my trunk and driven it to a bank where the manager knows me by the quiet way I ask for a safe deposit box, and then, because revenge deserves a little seasoning, I sent a bright, chirpy message into the family group chat with a photo of the empty storage unit and a caption that said the facility had raised rates and, since I had shouldered the bill for years, I had closed it out. But not to worry, because I had already digitized everything worth keeping and arranged a neat folder the family could access if they wanted to make a slideshow for the next holiday, which prompted a flurry of performative gratitude from cousins and a couple of brittle questions from my mother about chain of custody that she tried to disguise as curiosity. I answered with the same breezy tone people use when they talk about the weather. Then I let the silence expand just enough for her to hear what was inside it, which was the simple fact that custody is not a chain when you hold both ends. By dinner time, Daniel had called twice, the second time with that edge in his voice that tells you a man who thinks he is owed the world has finally Googled something and discovered that it cannot recover items that were never part of the estate. And Michelle had posted a vague story about trust and respect set over a photo of a candle that looked like it wanted to file a complaint, and my mother had not messaged me at all, which was louder than any speech she could have given, because even she understood that her favorite stage does not have props anymore. My revenge for the day was simple and clean. Remove the narrative leverage, secure the artifacts, let them chase ghosts and paperwork while I sipped tea and scheduled a scan of the last Fragile album, and as I powered down my laptop, I allowed myself a small, unkind thought, which was that sometimes justice looks like a door sliding down on a unit that you emptied hours earlier. I went to bed early with the knowledge tucked under my ribs like a secret note, and I promised myself I would keep playing the quiet game a little longer, because suspense is not only for audiences, it is also a tool. And tomorrow I would pick up the envelope from the bank and read the line my grandmother underlined twice, the one my mother never saw and my siblings would not understand until it cost them sleep. And if they thought the storage unit was the whole trick, they were welcome to that comfortable mistake, since by morning one thing would be missing from the old fireproof safe at my mother's house, not because I stole it, but because I had placed it someplace smarter years ago. The writer that decides whether the house can ever be part of any will at all. The envelope from the bank spent the morning in my bag like a warm stone, steadying my hands while I navigated the day's ordinary errands. Because nothing calms you quite like knowing the loudest person in the room is performing on a stage whose floorboards you quietly replaced years ago. And as I sat in a corner booth of a diner that smells like strong coffee and second chances, I unfolded my grandmother's letter for the 100th time, tracing the neat underlines that were more disciplined Then love notes yet softer than legal briefs, and I let her voice walk me back through the decisions that everyone else in the family had treated as boring clerical chores, the tedious glue no one wants to handle until the frame falls apart. She had written plainly about the house my mother worships like a trophy and about the tiny strip of gravel that makes the property usable, noting with grandmotherly patience that when the county split the subdivision decades ago they recorded a peculiar easement and an even more peculiar tax parcel for the strip, and that the family, being theatrically allergic to paperwork, had allowed the parcel's mail to drift into junk piles and the bills to be paid by whoever has the checkbook. A system my mother prefers because it turns chaos into power so long as no one reads the fine print. I had read the fine print, not because I was a genius, but because I was tired, and tired people either collapse or learn to make fatigue work like a metronome that keeps them moving in small consistent steps. So years back, when a yellow notice arrived about a delinquent microparcel tax on the gravel ribbon that looks like nothing until a storm turns the lawn into soup, I paid the fee, and then I did the very dull thing and called the county to ask why the strip had its own parcel number and whether anyone, hypothetically, could bid at a little-known tax sale for such a ridiculous rectangle, and the clerk, who sounded like someone who has watched generations forget where their rights begin and end, explained that yes, the strip could be acquired if no one redeemed it, and that if someone did acquire it, the easement that allows driveway use would still exist on paper, but insurance companies and banks get jumpy when access rests on paperwork no one in the family has actually seen since the 80s. I am not cruel. I am practical, and practicality in my family reads as rebellion, so I did not announce a coup. I simply showed up at the sale with a certified check for an amount that would not buy a decent bicycle, and I took title to the sliver that looks worthless. Then I formed a boring little limited liability company with a sleepy name, and I deeded the strip to it. Not as a weapon, but as a seatbelt, because I knew one day someone would swerve hard. Meanwhile, I kept doing the other unglamorous things that make wills wilt, starting with beneficiary designations on accounts that my grandmother started for house maintenance, which my mother treated like a personal applause fund and I treated like a restricted instrument, calling the bank with the patience of a librarian to make sure the designations were payable on death to me, and that they would supersede any poetic bequests my mother penned on scented stationery. Then I reviewed the dusty folder labeled insurance and confirmed that the little policy my grandmother kept out of habit had an irrevocable beneficiary. You do not have to be loud to be permanent. You just have to be filed correctly. I gathered copies. I time-stamped my notes. I backed them up where only I could see, and I went back to living within my own arithmetic while Daniel filmed another pep talk about ambition in a gym he pays for late, and Michelle curated sorrow like it was a lifestyle brand. After the birthday stunt, my mother made her first move by calling an attorney whose voice is locally famous for its ability to turn scolding into strategy, and I know this because relatives who adore gossip more than God cannot resist narrating their afternoons. So by lunchtime, I also knew that she intended to update not only her will but her estate picture, a phrase people use when they want money to behave like obedient children, and that is when the warm stone in my bag did its job. Because I folded the letter, paid my bill, and went to the notary across the parking lot to execute 2 tidy documents that had been drafted long ago and only needed dates. One, a memorandum affirming my company's ownership of the access parcel with instructions to the county to route all future notices to me, and the other a courteous, absolutely non-inflammatory license agreement that offered the main property permission to use the strip for 5 years at a fee of $1 automatically renewing, unless revoked for breach, accompanied by a polite cover letter stating that the license is a neighborly courtesy and that the holder should maintain insurance listing my company as an additional interest. It was not a chokehold, it was a seatbelt now with a buckle, and anyone who has ever had a loan denied over a missing form understands that buckles move the world. I sent the packet by certified mail to my mother's attorney and, because I believe in symmetry, I emailed my mother a sunny message with a PDF of the stamped receipt and an invitation to forward it to her insurers, assuring her that nothing would change in daily life and that I was simply regularizing what had been informal because informality breeds expensive misunderstandings. which is the kind of sentence that floats right past people until a banker underlines it with a red pen. Then I turned to the maintenance accounts and, using the beneficiary triggers I had confirmed years before, I requested updated statements showing that upon the policy's maturity or upon the account holder's passing, phrases that make everyone reach for water, the funds would move outside probate according to instructions that have already been verified, which is to say that the will she weaponized at a party has no jurisdiction over the plumbing that carries actual money. By late afternoon, the first ripple arrived in the family chat as Daniel posted a screenshot of an email from his lender asking a bland question about clean access to the primary residence, followed by 3 dots and then nothing. While Michelle texted me privately to ask if I was okay, in the tone people use when they want you to soothe them for a fire they helped light, and I replied that I was wonderfully okay and that everything was perfectly ordinary, which was true. Because ordinary is a tool, and it works best when you hold it like a scalpel. My revenge for the day was not flaming or cinematic. It was about tied in the right place, a nudge that reminds powerful people that doors swing on hinges they never bothered to oil, and as the sun went down I received a short, clipped email from my mother's attorney requesting a meeting to clarify your position, which I accepted with a friendly line about how I love clarity, and then I closed my laptop knowing that, come morning, the conversation would start with a question about who owns a sliver of gravel and would end with a quiet understanding that speeches about wills do not move gates that I keep locked with a very small, very legal key. When I walked into the attorney's office 2 days later, I could feel the temperature in the room before anyone even spoke, that quiet drop in warmth that comes when people realize the ground they thought was marble is actually ice and someone else holds the salt. My mother sat rigid in a tailored jacket she rarely wears outside of funerals or fundraisers, her lips pressed so thin they looked carved rather than living, while Daniel leaned back in his chair like a man rehearsing confidence, but fiddling with his phone too often. And Michelle clutched a leather tote as if it held more than tissues and receipts. The attorney began with courtesy, speaking about clarity and cooperation, but the way his eyes darted to the folder in my lap told me he knew this would not be a negotiation so much as an education. And for once it was not me on the receiving end of a lecture. I laid the packet on the polished table with deliberate calm, explaining that I was simply ensuring continuity and order, that no one needed to panic, and that access to the driveway was secure so long as the courtesy license was respected, which meant insurance updates and acknowledgement of my company's role, nothing more. The attorney read quickly, his brows tightening at each clause, and my mother shifted uncomfortably, trying to mask her agitation with a huff of disbelief. Daniel finally broke the silence, scoffing that it was just gravel and that I was making it dramatic, but when the attorney cleared his throat and explained in measured terms that banks, insurers, and buyers treat just gravel as a linchpin, Daniel's laugh cracked like cheap glass. Michelle tried the sympathy angle, saying she knew I didn't mean to complicate things, that we were all family, but her voice trembled, betraying that she knew precisely how complicated this was. The meeting ended without fireworks, which was more satisfying than any shouting match, because silence after revelation is thicker than smoke after an explosion, and as I walked out, I could feel their eyes stabbing my back with the weight of questions they would never ask directly. That afternoon the family chat turned sour, cousins whispering about greed, old friends of my mother suddenly quiet, and distant relatives messaging me privately to confess they always knew favoritism was rotting the foundation. Daniel, unable to contain himself, posted a vague tirade about betrayal and property rights, clearly directed at me though couched in fake generalities, while Michelle posted a soft focus photo of her child with a caption about protecting what truly matters, a desperate attempt to redirect sympathy. My mother said nothing at all, and her silence was louder than Daniel's fury or Michelle's performative vulnerability. What they did not understand, and what I never explained, is that this was never only about the parcel or the paperwork. It was about shifting the fulcrum of control so that every time they tried to lean on me, they felt their own weight pressing back. For years they had dismissed my caution as paranoia, my insistence on reading everything as fussiness, and my refusal to beg as arrogance. But now each of those traits had hardened into armor, and when they tried to strike, they hit steel. My revenge in those days was subtle and constant. I refused to respond with anger, I refused to clarify beyond the documents, and I refused to let them rewrite the narrative of me as the bitter outsider. Instead, I presented myself as calm, cooperative, almost generous, while they scrambled to explain why calmness felt like dominance and why cooperation sounded like ownership. One evening, Daniel called me directly, his voice low and sharp, demanding to know what else I had done behind everyone's back. I let him speak, his words tumbling out like coins in a jar, accusations about greed, about betrayal, about me being the reason the family was fractured. When he finally paused, waiting for a denial or confession, I simply asked him how his latest loan application was going, the one he had boasted about at the party. The silence that followed told me all I needed. The bank had already flagged the parcel issue, and his golden voice swagger was cracking under the weight of paperwork he never bothered to read. Michelle tried a different approach a day later, inviting me to lunch, just as sisters, as though a shared salad could erase decades of manipulation. But her smile wavered when I reminded her that she once testified to my mother that I was too cold to handle family matters, a remark I had never forgotten. I left her at the cafe, staring into her untouched latte while I paid the bill with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly what the gesture meant. At night, I would sit in my living room, surrounded by the boxes I had relocated, flipping through photographs of generations who had never imagined their descendants would turn inheritance into war. I felt no triumph in seeing their young faces smiling, only a strange clarity that legacy is not about who writes the will but about who carries the weight of remembering, preserving, and protecting. My mother wanted to cut me out publicly, to humiliate me into silence, but instead she had revealed the weakness of her entire construct, that everything she controlled was fragile because it depended on loyalty she had never truly earned. The cracks widened every day, not because I pushed, but because I stopped holding the beams upright. I had been the silent scaffolding for years, the one who managed the errands, filed the papers, paid the unnoticed bills, and in stepping back I exposed just how hollow their triumphs were. My revenge was not a single blow but a quiet removal of support, and as they stumbled, their attempts to regain footing became the spectacle they once enjoyed watching me endure. And every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the echo of my own voice at the party, calm and unshaken, reminding them and myself that I had already secured everything they could not touch, a sentence that had grown heavier with every passing day. The final unraveling did not arrive with sirens or slammed doors, but with the steady drip of consequences that could no longer be patched over by charm, denial, or the illusion of family solidarity. And by the time my mother attempted to gather everyone at her house for what she called a reset dinner, the air between us had already hardened into something brittle, where every word threatened to snap into shards. I arrived later than expected, walking past the familiar porch that once felt like a sanctuary, but now resembled a stage set for a play whose actors had forgotten their lines, and I could sense the tension pressing against the windows before I even stepped inside. Daniel was pacing near the dining room archway, his tie loosened and his face blotched from the effort of containing his temper, while Michelle perched at the table, performing sadness with downcast eyes and trembling hands that looked carefully arranged for maximum sympathy. My mother stood at the head of the table, dressed in black as though mourning an empire that had crumbled, her shoulders drawn tight and her voice sharp as glass as she greeted me with a stiff nod instead of words of welcome. The dinner began with forced civility, plates passed around without thanks, shallow comments about weather and neighborhood gossip that collapsed into silence almost as soon as they were spoken. Then, inevitably, my mother raised her voice, declaring that it was time to clear the air, though her tone made it clear that clearing the air meant me confessing, apologizing, and returning what she believed I had stolen. She spoke of betrayal, of how family should stand together, of how I had humiliated her in front of her friends, and of how she had every right to decide what her legacy would be. Her speech might have swayed a room of neighbors or acquaintances, but here it sounded hollow, because everyone at the table already knew the truth. Her will was a script with no stage, and the assets she brandished like weapons had already slipped beyond her grasp. I let her finish without interruption, sipping water and watching the candlelight tremble in the reflection of the silverware, because silence often speaks louder than rebuttal. When she finally paused, demanding I respond, I leaned forward and spoke evenly, reminding her that I had not taken anything from her, that I had simply managed what had been neglected, secured what had been left vulnerable, and protected what she had treated as props in her endless performance of control. I explained that the parcel, the accounts, the designations, all of them were legal, transparent, and entirely outside the jurisdiction of any will she could draft. I reminded her, with calm precision, that wills only control what remains unclaimed, and that I had claimed nothing except responsibility in the years she dismissed it as boring. The words cut not because they were cruel, but because they were undeniable, and as I spoke, Daniel's fists clenched tighter, Michelle's lip quivered in practiced despair, and my mother's mask cracked into a grimace that revealed not strength but fear. Daniel exploded first, slamming his palm against the table and accusing me of ruining his financial future, of blocking loans he had been promised, of turning the family into a battlefield for my ego trip. I let him rant, let his voice grow hoarse, and then I asked him quietly how many of his promises had ever been kept without someone else cleaning up after him. His silence that followed was louder than his outburst, and though his anger didn't fade, his confidence drained in front of everyone's eyes. Michelle then tried to weep her way into reconciliation, speaking about the importance of unity and forgiveness, about how we could still choose love over greed, but the tears fell too quickly. And when I asked her whether forgiveness included acknowledging the years she stood by while I was belittled, she could not meet my eyes. My mother tried one last maneuver, demanding that I at least share what I had secured, but the absurdity of the request silenced even Daniel, because nothing I held was theirs to bargain over anymore. The dinner ended in fragments, with no toast, no dessert, and no hugs at the doorway, just the sound of chairs scraping and doors shutting harder than necessary. I walked out into the night air, the sky above me heavy with clouds that refused to break, and I felt not triumph but a peculiar stillness, as though revenge was not the fire I once imagined but a cold, steady current pulling me away from a shore I had tried too long to anchor myself to. I understood, standing there on the walkway, that I had already won in ways they could never undo, not simply because of paperwork or parcels, but because I had freed myself from the game they insisted on playing. They were trapped in a theater of wills and pronouncements, clinging to applause that no longer mattered, while I had stepped quietly into a reality where their control no longer reached. In the days that followed, word spread through extended family and acquaintances, each person retelling the story in fragments, some painting me as ruthless, others as clever, but none of them able to ignore the truth that the power dynamic had shifted permanently. My mother withdrew from her social circle, ashamed of the whispers she could not silence. Daniel sank deeper into debt with no lifeline to save him, and Michelle drowned herself in curated sympathy online. And me, I lived quietly, managing what I had secured, never flaunting it, never needing to explain, knowing that their greatest punishment was the gnawing uncertainty of not knowing where my power began or where it ended. Even now, when I replay the party in my head, I hear my own voice above the clinking glasses, calm and certain as I told them I had already secured everything they could not touch. They thought it was a bluff, a dramatic flourish to hide wounded pride, but the truth had always been in the steadiness of my tone. What I secured was not only property or accounts, but a life unbound by their approval, a legacy of my own design, and a freedom they could neither give nor take away. And as I stand at the edge of it all, watching the empire my mother tried to build crumble into dust, I realize that the most untouchable thing I hold is not the deed or the designation, but the knowledge that I no longer need their recognition to prove that I have already won.